The air on Guadalcanal was not air. It was a physical weight, a wet green blanket woven from heat and rot and the smell of things dying for Private Miller, crouched in the dubious shelter of his canvas tent. The rain was not a sound but a concussion. Each drop hit the taut fabric like a fist, a ceaseless drumming that vibrated through the mud, through his boots, and into his bones. The water didn't fall. It descended in solid, gray sheets, turning the volcanic soil of the island into a liquid world, a primordial soup of grit and despair. He watched a river of brown water carve a path through their small encampment, carrying with it the detritus of their precarious existence. A discarded ration tin, a single sock, the green skin of a coconut. This was their toehold on the edge of the world, a world that wanted them gone. The jungle steamed around them, a living entity that whispered with insects the size of his thumb and things that slithered in the night. The enemy was out there, in that suffocating green, but the more immediate foe was the island itself. Tents sagged and collapsed under the deluge. Rifles rusted. Boots, perpetually soaked, began to disintegrate. And in the oppressive humidity, even the smallest cut on a man's skin could fester, turning into a jungle sore that ate at the flesh with a malevolent hunger. Miller shifted, the motion pulling at the damp wool of his uniform. He and the others in his platoon were 20-year-old men from Ohio and Texas and California, boys who had known summer storms and winter snows, but nothing had prepared them for this. This was a war not just of bullets and bayonets, but of attrition against the very elements. They were fighting for a patch of mud that was actively trying to swallow them. Every morning, the commanding officer would walk the line, his face a mask of grim determination, asking the same question, "How's morale?" And every morning, they would lie. Morale was a currency they couldn't afford to spend. It was a fiction they maintained, a collective hallucination that kept them from sinking into the mud alongside their foundering tents. But fictions have a breaking point. As another night descended, bringing with it a fresh torrent and the distant, hollow crump of artillery, Miller looked at the failing canvas above him and wondered about the nature of shelter. What was it, really? A roof? 4 walls? In this place, it was the fragile idea of separation, a thin membrane between a man and the overwhelming hostility of the universe, and that membrane was tearing. They were fighting a two-front war, one against the Empire of Japan and another against a planet that seemed determined to reclaim its territory, one soaked and shivering soldier at a time. The problem was immense, bigger than any single battle. It was a question of logistics, of engineering, of survival itself. How do you house an army on the move, an army fighting in the most inhospitable places on Earth? How do you build a home on ground that is actively trying to kill you? The answer, when it came, would not be found on the battlefield. It was being forged thousands of miles away, in the cold, clear air of a Rhode Island winter, by men who had never felt the sucking mud of the Pacific, but who understood the geometry of strength and the arithmetic of urgency. Before the rain and the mud of the Pacific, there was the cold steel and brisk wind of Narragansett Bay. The story of the solution begins not in the jungle, but in a place of order and industry. Naval Air Station Quonset Point, Rhode Island. In the spring of 1941, months before the cataclysm of Pearl Harbor, America was already a nation holding its breath. The Lend-Lease Act had been signed, turning the country into the arsenal of democracy, and the gears of its immense industrial capacity were beginning to grind into motion. The United States Navy, looking east and west across 2 vast oceans, understood a fundamental truth of modern warfare. Victory would belong not just to the side with the most guns, but to the side that could project its power most effectively. And projecting power required bases, hundreds of them, forward operating bases for aircraft, supply depots, barracks for troops, hospitals for the wounded. They would be needed in the frozen expanse of the Aleutians, the deserts of North Africa, and the myriad, malaria-ridden islands of the Pacific. The logistical challenge was staggering. Traditional military construction, with its reliance on lumber, concrete, and skilled carpenters, was a non-starter. You couldn't ship tons of raw materials and a battalion of craftsmen to every remote atoll. Tents, the default solution for armies on the march for centuries, were hopelessly inadequate against the extremes of global warfare. They rotted in the tropics, offered no protection from shrapnel, and were shredded by the hurricane-force winds that scoured the Pacific. The military needed something new, something revolutionary. They needed a building that could be mass-produced, like a Jeep, shipped flat in a crate like a rifle, and assembled on any patch of ground by a handful of untrained men with simple hand tools. They needed a miracle. The call went out from the Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks. The specifications they drafted sounded less like an architectural brief and more like a list of impossible demands. The structure had to be lightweight, yet incredibly strong. It needed to be assembled in a single day by a crew of no more than 10 men. It had to withstand winds of over 100 miles per hour. It needed no foundation, yet must remain stable on sand, rock, or mud. And it had to be cheap. The Navy turned to the George A. Fuller Company, a construction giant already at work building the massive new air station at Quonset Point. The company was given just 60 days to turn this fantasy into a functional prototype. The American engineers did not start from a blank page. They had a president, a ghost from a previous war. During the First World War, the British had faced a similar, though less global, problem. Their solution was the Nissen hut, a semi-cylindrical shelter made of corrugated iron sheets bolted to a steel frame. It was a clever design, patented by its inventor, Major Peter Nissen, and it had sheltered hundreds of thousands of Tommies in the muddy fields of Flanders. The Navy obtained the blueprints for the Nissen hut, and a team of architects, led by Otto Brandenberger, laid them out on their drafting tables at Quonset Point. They saw its genius immediately, the inherent strength of the arch, a shape that naturally sheds water and deflects wind. But they also saw its flaws that made it unsuitable for the coming war. The British Nissen hut was heavy. Its steel frame was cumbersome, and its corrugated panels were thick and difficult to transport. Crucially, it required an internal frame of steel or wood ribs that the outer skin was bolted to. This meant more parts to ship, a more complex assembly, and in the jungles of the Pacific, any wooden components would be an open invitation to termites. Furthermore, the original design required foundation bolts set in concrete, a luxury that would be impossible on a freshly captured beachhead. The team at Quonset Point, working under immense pressure, began a process of radical simplification and improvement. Their key innovation, the leap of genius that would define their creation, was to eliminate the internal frame altogether. They envisioned a structure where the corrugated steel skin was the frame. By using lighter channel-grooved steel ribs and bolting the corrugated sheets directly to them, they created a unified, self-supporting arch. The strength was no longer in a separate skeleton, but in the shape of the skin itself. This made the entire structure lighter, required fewer components, and was dramatically faster to assemble. They redesigned the dimensions, settling on a standard model 16 feet wide and 36 feet long, with an 8-foot radius. The ends would be simple plywood panels, pre-cut with openings for a door and 2 windows. The interior would have a wood floor, and could be lined with pressed wood for insulation. Every piece was designed for simplicity. The steel ribs were pre-drilled. The nuts and bolts were standardized. The entire structure could be broken down and packed into a set of wooden crates, a building in a box. In May of 1941, just under the 60-day deadline, the first prototype stood gleaming on the shores of Narragansett Bay. It was half a cylinder of raw steel, starkly functional and strangely beautiful in its geometric purity. It had no frills, no ornamentation. It was an object stripped down to its essential purpose, shelter. The Navy brass came to inspect it. They watched as a small crew of Seabees, the Navy's newly formed construction battalions, swarmed over the crates. Using only wrenches and screwdrivers, they laid the wooden floor, assembled the curved steel ribs, and began bolting the corrugated sheets into place, working from the ground up on both sides until the panels met at the apex. Within hours, the structure was complete. It was a stunning display of speed and efficiency. The Navy was impressed. They named it after the place of its birth, the Quonset hut, and then they placed an order that would stagger the imagination. The impossible had been made real. Now it had to be multiplied. The birth of the Quonset hut was a feat of engineering. Its proliferation was a miracle of industrial production. As the first prototype was being tested at Quonset Point, the United States was still technically at peace, but the nation's factories were already beginning to pivot, shifting from the rhythms of civilian life to the urgent cadence of war. The order from the Navy was not for a few hundred huts, or even a few thousand. It was for tens of thousands, and it was needed yesterday. Between 1,941 and 1,945, an estimated 150,000 to 170,000 Quonset huts would be manufactured. It was an industrial flood of steel and sweat, a testament to America's ability to transform an idea into a physical reality on a planetary scale. The George A. Fuller Company, having designed the hut, was initially tasked with its production. A dedicated factory was established in West Davisville, Rhode Island, along the New Haven Railroad line, perfectly positioned for rapid transport. But the demand quickly outstripped the capacity of any single company. The Navy and the War Production Board contracted with dozens of other firms across the country, companies that had previously made grain silos, automobile parts, and steel water tanks. Firms like the Strand Steel Corporation, a subsidiary of the Great Lakes Steel Corporation, retooled their entire operations to stamp, cut, and package the components for the huts. The Quonset hut was no longer a bespoke invention. It was a mass-produced commodity, rolling off assembly lines like the tanks and planes it would serve alongside. The genius of the system was its absolute standardization. Every rib, every panel, every nut and bolt was interchangeable, whether it was made in Rhode Island or Illinois. Each hut was shipped as a complete kit, a self-contained package of potential. The standard 20x4 8-foot model, which became the most common design, was packed into crates weighing a total of around 5 tons. These crates could be loaded into the hold of a Liberty ship, stacked on a flatbed rail car, or hauled by a pair of trucks. Inside was everything needed for assembly: the steel arches, the corrugated sheets, the plywood end walls, windows, a door, insulation, flooring, and a small wood-burning stove for heat. Even the tools, wrenches, hammers, screwdrivers were included. It was a building reduced to its constituent parts, a giant mechanical puzzle waiting to be solved. The men tasked with solving that puzzle were, more often than not, the Seabees. The Navy's construction battalions were a unique breed, recruited for their civilian skills as carpenters, electricians, welders, and heavy equipment operators. Their motto was "Can Do," a reflection of their mission to build anything, anywhere, under any conditions. The Quonset hut was tailor-made for their ethos. It was a structure that rewarded grit and teamwork over specialized training. A crew of 8 to 10 Seabees, or even regular GIs with minimal instruction, could take a Quonset hut from crate to completion in a single day, sometimes in as little as 6 to 8 hours. The process became a practiced choreography of organized chaos on beachheads and newly cleared airstrips around the world. The crates would be broken open, the parts laid out in an orderly fashion. First, the wood floor would be assembled and laid directly on the ground, or on small pilings if the terrain was uneven or swampy. Then came the raising of the ribs. The curved steel arches were bolted together on the ground and then lifted into place, one by one, and secured to the floor frame. The lightness of the components was key. No cranes or heavy machinery were needed, just manpower. Once the skeleton of arches was erect, the skinning would begin. 2 teams would start at the bottom, on opposite sides, bolting the pre-drilled corrugated sheets to the ribs. They worked their way up towards the crown, the sheets overlapping to ensure a watertight seal. A mastic compound was often applied to the seams to further waterproof the structure. Finally, the prefabricated plywood end walls were hoisted into place and bolted to the first and last arches, and the door and windows were fitted. The last step was often the installation of the small stovepipe, poking jauntily through the curved roof, a sign that this shell of steel was now a place for men to live. This process was repeated tens of thousands of times in every theater of the war, while German engineers were pouring massive amounts of concrete for their heavily fortified bunkers, and Japanese defenders were painstakingly carving caves into volcanic rock. American forces were raising entire towns of steel almost overnight. On the eve of the D-Day invasion, Seabees constructed a massive depot in Exeter, England, using hundreds of Quonset huts to store supplies for the amphibious assault. On newly captured islands in the Pacific, fleets of bulldozers would clear a patch of jungle, and within days a new airbase would spring into existence, complete with Quonset barracks, Quonset mess halls, Quonset chapels, and Quonset repair shops. It was a logistical weapon, a way of projecting not just military force, but civilization itself, or at least a crude, functional facsimile of it, into the most desolate corners of the globe. The Quonset hut wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of America's industrial might, an expression of a uniquely American approach to warfare, overwhelming, pragmatic, and built to move. The Quonset hut went to war on every front, a silent, corrugated witness to the global conflict. Over 150,000 of them were deployed, creating a scattered, temporary empire of steel that stretched from the icy shores of Greenland to the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima. Each location tested the simple design in different, brutal ways. The hut was a chameleon, a universal solution applied to 1,000 specific problems, and its success or failure often depended on the ingenuity of the men who lived inside it. In the Pacific, the Quonset hut faced its trial by fire and water. On islands like Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and Saipan, the primary enemy was the environment itself. Here, the hut was a refuge from the torrential rains, a shield against the swarms of malarial mosquitoes, but it was also, in the suffocating heat, an oven. The uninsulated steel skin would absorb the ferocious tropical sun, turning the interior into a sauna. Soldiers would joke that you could fry an egg on the floor by mid-morning. The sound of the daily downpour on the metal roof was a constant, deafening drumbeat, a sound that became the defining soundtrack of the Pacific War for millions of men. A soldier stationed in the Philippines wrote home, It rains every day. Not a shower, but a flood. When it hits the roof of our hut, you can't hear the man next to you speak. It's like living inside a drum during a parade. The men adapted. They learned to prop open the doors and windows at both ends to create a cross breeze. The Seabees, ever resourceful, began to modify the design for tropical conditions. They would raise the huts on blocks to allow air to circulate underneath, which also helped prevent flooding and protected the wooden floors from termites. In some cases, they omitted the lower wall panels entirely, creating a breezier open-air shelter. The flexible design of the hut allowed for these field modifications. Its simplicity was its strength. And when the typhoons came, as they inevitably did, the Quonset hut proved its mettle. The low, curved profile allowed the ferocious winds to flow over it rather than smash against it. While traditional wooden structures and tents were often blown to splinters, the anchored steel huts would groan and shudder, but they would hold. After a major typhoon swept through Guam in 1944, reconnaissance reports noted that while much of the base was flattened, the fields of Quonset huts remained largely intact. Physics had proven to be a better defense than rigid strength. In the European and Aleutian theaters, the challenge was the opposite. In the bitter cold of Alaska, Iceland, and the Ardennes forest, the hut had to be a sanctuary from the cold, not the heat. The standard insulation was often inadequate against sub-zero temperatures. Condensation would form on the inside of the cold steel walls and freeze, creating a layer of interior frost. Men would wake up to find their blankets frozen to the wall. To combat this, soldiers would scrounge for extra insulating materials, lining the walls with anything they could find: cardboard, empty sandbags, even newspapers from home. Floors were layered with tar paper to prevent the damp cold from seeping up from the frozen ground. The small wood or oil stove that came with each hut became the absolute center of life, a glowing heart around which the occupants would huddle, drying their socks and brewing coffee. But the Quonset hut was more than just a barracks. Its simple, open-plan interior made it endlessly versatile. With the interior partitions removed, it became a mess hall where hundreds of men could eat. With cots replaced by desks and radios, it was a command post where colonels planned the next day's attack. Link 2 or 3 huts together, and you had a field hospital. The sterile white of doctors' coats, a stark contrast to the corrugated gray walls. C.B. Bruce Goff, who would later become a renowned architect, famously converted 2 large elephant Quonset huts into a stunning chapel at Camp Parks, California, proving that even this most utilitarian of structures could house the sacred. It was used as a movie theater, a supply depot, a brig, a bakery, and a photo lab. The hut was a blank slate, a steel canvas onto which the military could project its every need. For the men inside, life in the hut was a communal experience defined by a complete lack of privacy. You lived, slept, and breathed in a space shared with 20 or 30 other men. You knew who snored, who talked in his sleep, who received letters from home, and who didn't. The huts became small, self-contained worlds, each with its own character. The curved walls were a gallery for pin-ups from Yank magazine and treasured photographs of wives and sweethearts. A small touch of humanity taped to the cold steel. Makeshift shelves were fashioned from ammunition crates to hold books and personal belongings. A single bare light bulb often hung from the ceiling, casting long shadows down the length of the curved interior. In this shared space, a small object could take on immense symbolic weight. A Zippo lighter, with its familiar metallic click, was not just for lighting a cigarette. It was a small piece of American manufacturing, a reliable tool in an unreliable world. A stick of Wrigley's gum, passed between soldiers before a patrol, was a taste of home, a fleeting moment of sweetness in a bitter landscape. These small rituals, these shared objects, were the glue that held together the fragile societies living inside the steel arches. The Quonset hut was the container for these lives, the backdrop for the boredom, the fear, and the camaraderie that defined a soldier's existence. It wasn't a home, not by any stretch of the imagination, but for millions of young men far from their own homes, in the midst of the most violent conflict in human history, this strange, curved building was the closest thing they had. It was shelter. It was enough. The war ended. The thunder of artillery faded, replaced by the rustle of demobilization papers. Millions of soldiers, sailors, and Marines began the long journey home, leaving behind the landscapes that had been scarred by battle. And on those landscapes, they left behind the silent witnesses to their presence, the Quonset huts. Suddenly, the U.S. military had a surplus of more than 150,000 prefabricated steel buildings scattered across 6 continents. What was once a critical asset of war became an enormous logistical problem of peace. The original plan had been to treat them as temporary structures, to be scrapped or abandoned once the fighting was over. But the world that emerged from the rubble of war had needs that were just as urgent, if not as violent, as those of the conflict itself. America was facing a severe housing crisis. 12 million veterans returned, eager to start families and build new lives, only to find a nation with a critical shortage of homes. Construction had been almost entirely halted during the war years, and the population had boomed. Newspapers were filled with stories of families living in converted trolley cars and makeshift shacks. Into this void stepped the humble Quonset hut. The military began selling off its surplus stock to the public, and an object of war began an unexpected second life as an icon of the American post-war era. For a veteran with a few $100s and a piece of land, a surplus Quonset hut was a promise. It was the chance to build a home quickly and cheaply. The Strand Steel Company began marketing them directly to civilians, advertising kits for as little as $1.50 per square foot, all across the country, particularly in the burgeoning suburbs of the West. Small communities of these strange, half-cylindrical houses began to appear. They were adapted and modified in countless ingenious ways. Visionary homeowners added large picture windows to the plywood end walls, built brick facades to hide the corrugated steel, and divided the open interiors into kitchens, living rooms, and bedrooms. In Los Angeles, one of the largest temporary housing projects for veterans was Roger Young Village, a sprawling community of 750 Quonset huts that provided a crucial stepping stone for thousands of families. The huts also filled a desperate need on college campuses. The GI Bill sent a tidal wave of veterans back to school, overwhelming universities that were not equipped to house them. Quonset huts were hastily erected on quads and lawns, becoming temporary dormitories, classrooms, and libraries. At the University of Iowa, a complex of huts known as Quonset Park housed married students. At Rhode Island State College, they lined Rhode Vet Row. For a generation of students, the sound of rain on a curved steel roof was the soundtrack to their higher education. Beyond housing, the Quonset hut proved to be as versatile in peace as it had been in war. Its wide, open-span interior made it ideal for all sorts of commercial uses. They became garages, repair shops, and small diners. Farmers bought them in droves, recognizing their value as durable, inexpensive barns for storing hay and sheltering livestock. They were transformed into small-town movie theaters, bowling alleys, and even churches. A 1,946 press release from Strand Steel listed over 250 different civilian adaptations for the hut, a testament to the boundless creativity of post-war America. However, the Quonset hut never fully shed the stigma of its military origins. For many veterans, living in one was a constant reminder of the life they had just left behind, of the regimented, communal existence in the barracks. The sloping sides created unusable space along the edges of the interior, making it difficult to place furniture. And aesthetically, the bare industrial look of corrugated steel struggled to compete with the appeal of traditional, stick-built homes that represented the suburban dream. As the post-war economy boomed and conventional housing became more available, the Quonset hut as a primary residence quickly fell out of favor. Many were torn down, while others were relegated to the roles they still often fill today, as storage sheds, workshops, and agricultural outbuildings, their curved shoulders often hidden behind more conventional facades. Yet, the impact of the Quonset hut was more profound than the number of surviving structures might suggest. It had accidentally kick-started a revolution in architecture and construction. The war had proven the viability and efficiency of prefabrication on a massive scale. The idea that a building could be manufactured in a factory, shipped in a box, and assembled on site would have a lasting influence on everything from disaster relief housing to modern modular construction. The hut's minimalist, form follows function aesthetic resonated with the principles of modernist architecture, even if the architects themselves were slow to embrace it. It was a purely functional object that, through its ubiquity and simple geometry, acquired a strange and accidental beauty. It was an honest building, a structure that wore its engineering on its sleeve. The war had created an impossible problem, and the Quonset hut was the elegantly simple solution. In the years of peace that followed, it stood as a quiet reminder that sometimes the most enduring innovations are born not of grand artistic visions, but of sheer, unadorned necessity. The arc of history is not always forged in the grand halls of power or on the most famous battlefields. Sometimes it is stamped in a sheet of corrugated steel. The story of the Quonset hut is a story of a shape, a simple semicircle that sheltered a generation and, in its own quiet way, helped reshape the world. It was never meant to be a permanent fixture in the landscape. It was designed for impermanence, a temporary solution to a temporary crisis. Yet, 80 years later, the echoes of its form are still with us. You can see them from the window of a car, driving through the American Midwest, a rusty, curved roof rising above a cornfield, having served as a farmer's barn for longer than the war it was built for. You can find them on forgotten volcanic islands in the Pacific, slowly being consumed by the jungle they once held at bay, their steel skin bleeding a slow rust into the soil. They stand as silent monuments, not to generals or victories, but to the anonymous ingenuity of engineers and the resilience of the ordinary men who turned these steel shells into temporary homes. The Quonset hut was the physical embodiment of a particular American philosophy, a belief that any problem, no matter how vast, could be solved with enough industrial might and practical cleverness. It was a structure devoid of ideology, a purely pragmatic object. It did not care if it housed a Democrat or a Republican, a farm boy from Iowa or a factory worker from Detroit. It offered the same simple promise to all: shelter from the storm. In the Pacific, the storm was a typhoon. In Europe, it was a blizzard. Everywhere, it was the existential tempest of war. We began this story with a lone soldier in the mud of Guadalcanal, his world dissolving in a deluge of rain, questioning the very meaning of shelter. The Quonset hut was the answer to his question. It was not a perfect answer. It was loud in the rain, an oven in the sun, and a freezer in the snow. It offered no privacy and little comfort, but it was there. It was a roof over his head, a dry place to sleep, a thin but resilient membrane of civilization in the heart of chaos. Today, the principles behind its design, prefabrication, structural efficiency, material honesty, live on in emergency shelters deployed after earthquakes, in research stations in Antarctica, and even in conceptual designs for habitats on Mars. The impossible challenge issued in 1941 continues to find new answers, all tracing their lineage back to that simple curve of steel. The war is over, but the need for shelter is not. The hut endures, not just as a physical artifact, but as a powerful idea, that in the face of overwhelming forces, a simple, elegant, and robust solution can make all the difference. It is a quiet lesson, written in rust and steel, a story of how a building designed to last a year became an accidental icon, a symbol of a time when a nation, faced with an existential threat, chose to build its way to victory.